Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Welcome back to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville politics, government, education, business, news, events, arts, who knows, whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com, joined by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I am doing just fine. It's been a busy couple of weeks while someone that I know has been manning the Athens bureau of Compass, and you've got the more exciting stories to tell. You are our Compass's Odysseus, who has, as Homer put it, our hero who has traveled far and wide. And,
finally returned home. Did not run into any cyclopses or witches or any of those things, but did have a long layover, as in about 2 days in Frankfurt, Germany on the way home. But yes, thanks for welcoming me back, and thank you, Scott, for minding the home front while I was gone. It turned out to be a fairly active home front. Yeah,
it was very active. And one thing that that don't want to give anybody the impression was that your trip, I mean, you put in hours as well. It wasn't all drinking wine by the Aegean for you. So and I really appreciate that. Yeah, it was busy. And so we've got plenty of stuff to talk about that happened during the past week.
Yes, sadly, not. Actually, while I was in Greece, so we were in London for about 3 days, then Greece for about a week. There was an election in Greece. I didn't know there was going to be an election, so got a little taste of civic affairs there. But we're not going to talk about the Greek election.
Who did you vote for?
Well, I didn't even understand who the parties were. I had to ask somebody to explain the whole thing. It was their second election. They'd had an election the month before, but they didn't get a majority, and so then they had to have another election. And the one guy who we did talk to about it, he was just one of our bartenders, but he was basically like, yeah, the second election, nobody really cares. It's just, they were over it.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to commit voter fraud when you don't, can't understand the language.
Yes, so, no. But I will not be providing any travelogue because we do have a lot of things here to talk about. We had some interesting news actually just on Friday out of the Knoxville Police Department, which we'll hit on a little bit. University of Tennessee talking about its diversity efforts, coincidentally the same day that the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision about affirmative action. A couple of lawsuits challenging the state's restriction on transgender medical care. City Council talked about the alternative response model for responding to mental health crises. And to start us all off, Scott, you covered County Commission in my absence, and they voted on a resolution expressing support for what?
Well, it was support for renaming or restoring the name Kauai to, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I was going to ask. I haven't actually heard it pronounced.
Well, I've heard it pronounced, but I've also heard it pronounced a couple of different ways. So it's obviously not my not English, it's Cherokee, and it is the name the Cherokee had given to what we call Clingmans Dome. And there is a movement afoot to get the U.S. Board of Geographic Names to change the name from Clingmans Dome to Kuawhi and Kuawhi, and it is it's being pushed by primarily two organizers who are members of the Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band, and so they are trying to drum up support for the name change among folks in North Carolina and Tennessee, and they brought got a commission chair, Courtney Durrett, to bring a resolution to county commission expressing support for this. Obviously, it's a non-binding thing that's just kind of, hey, we're cheering this on. Most commissioners signed on to it. It's got a fairly interesting history. It was obviously before European settlers came into the area. Apparently, it was called Kuawhi.
And it's the highest point.
It is the highest peak in the Smoky Mountains,
mm-hmm.
and
it's where the observation tower is. Probably most of our listeners have been up there at one point or another.
And we'll get to the observation tower in just a moment. But it is the highest peak in the Smokies. Obviously, it's also where the state line is between Tennessee and North Carolina. The Appalachian Trail runs across the spine of the mountain, so it's it's kind of a big deal. And the Cherokee apparently called, that was the Cherokee name for it. Then in 1858, when Arnold Guyot, whose name is on the second highest peak in the Smokies, was naming mountains in the area that would eventually become the national park. And Nate decided that the highest peak should be named after a North Carolina senator named Thomas Lanier Clingman, and he was the first person to accurately measure the height of Clingmans Dome, and which is a little bit over 6,600 feet. And he later on became a Confederate general, big prominent North Carolina person, and it's been known as Clingmans Dome ever since. Most I said there were almost all the county commissioners had signed on as co-sponsors. One holdout on the co-sponsor was John Schoonmaker. He opposes changing the name because of its potential impact on tourism. Everybody knows it is Clingmans Dome. He was really focused on the observation tower, that it was, and in fact, when they actually discussed this at the work session on the 20th, and then at the last Monday's voting meeting, and he asked one of the organizers, Levita Hill, who asked her about do they intend to change the name of the tower and all this stuff, and of course Hill was basically saying, no, we want to change the name of the mountain, we don't care what you call the tower, you call the tower whatever you want, but and the National Park Service would be in charge of naming the tower. And at the work session, even though he'd signed on as a sponsor, Carson Daly, Commissioner Daly, had kind of asked if they were going to try to get any of the other mountains renamed. Hill said no. That seemed to be his concern, is that there would be a widespread renaming of mountains in the Smokies, and Hill, like I said, Hill said no, that this was their
we're not going to
primary
lose LeConte, in other words.
Mount LeConte, for example, is still going to be, they're not looking to change its name or change the name of Mount Guyot for that matter. And although LeConte is much more widely known, Guyot is a lot more inaccessible or less accessible than the other two. Anyway, when it came down to the vote, Schoonmaker voted against supporting the resolution, as did Daley. Everybody else voted for it. Richie Beeler wasn't there. Don't know how he would have voted, but the resolution passed. As I said, it really is not, it's non-binding. Doesn't really have much of an effect other than to say that there is a body in political body in Tennessee that is in support of it. That's something they can take to the board on geographic names. They're going to be going to other county commissions and probably city councils, and who knows who all they're trying to get on the Tennessee side. They do have support from the tribal council of the Eastern Band, Cherokee Indians, and so they're going to be moving on to other places and trying to get the support they need. The process on this is that you can petition the board to change a name. They take a lot of things into account, whether the name is appropriate. If it's they wouldn't be you couldn't put an Apache name on Clingmans Dome. It would have to be a Cherokee name. And various other factors are involved. The board just last year changed the name of Mount Doane in Yellowstone National Park to First Peoples Mountain, and that had support from some of the area tribes whose that was their ancestral lands. The most famous name change in the United States, of course, has been Mount McKinley to Denali. And I think I've talked about this before. In the 90s, they changed the name of the national park to Denali National Park, but they couldn't change the name because of a series of Ohio Congress members who ardently believed that it should remain McKinley because William McKinley was
right. William McKinley was from Ohio.
Even
though Denali itself is an awful long way from Ohio.
Yeah, yes. So
no super high peaks in Ohio that I know of.
The Bengals don't play exhibition games in Denali. So anyway, that went on for a couple of decades until in 2015 the Secretary of Interior, and which is allowed under the law. If the board doesn't take action, the Secretary of Interior could take unilateral action. And in 2015, the Secretary was like, hey, it's been a couple of decades and you haven't taken action, so I'm going to, and actually officially renamed it Denali. Although most people called it Denali anyway, or a lot of people called it Denali, because they thought when they changed the national park, they changed the mountain name. They didn't. But that, so there's plenty of precedence for this happening, and there's a lot of sentiment for that change to be made. Like I said, Schoonmaker's opposition was it's what everybody knows it as. It's what tourists will, think of Clingmans, that mountain as Clingmans Dome. There are 10 million of them who come to the Smokies every year. He's concerned about, people are going to have to change maps, they're going to change signs, they're going to change websites, they're going to change all kinds of stuff, and that would be true.
Sure.
But,
and people who grew up with it as Clingmans Dome would probably continue to call. I mean, these things take time to, even if they do make that change, it'll be more of a gradual thing in terms of people's awareness of it. Yeah. I don't honestly know how many people who go to the Smokies go there just to see Clingmans Dome. I think it's more kind of going to the national park than like, oh, let's go to Clingmans Dome per se. But it's a well-known name. I think that the Smokies, essentially is greater than the sum of its parts. Right.
You have, Mount LeConte is an iconic mountain. Clingmans Dome, because it's the highest point and it's easily, you can drive to Clingmans Dome. Right. I mean, that's
why so many people go.
That's why so many people go there. Cades Cove is an iconic spot, but it's the Smokies yeah, I think you're right. I think people do go to the Smokies to go to the Smokies and not do any particular. Some people might go to Cades Cove, but most people I think go for the entire experience.
Yeah,
and Dollywood.
Right. Yes. What was the original Cherokee name of Dollywood?
Boy, that's a good one. We'll have to I'll have to do more reporting. I'm sorry, I neglected to do that.
Well, it's an interesting discussion. Also, an interesting discussion of a completely different sort the next night at City Council this past week about the alternative response model and how the city might go about exploring it. And we've talked about this somewhat before on the podcast, but what happened at this week's, I gather, fairly lengthy discussion of this?
It was a lengthy discussion. There was a lot of political maneuvering that came into this, as we've talked about before. Alternative response in whatever form it takes is dispatching mental health professionals to scenes where someone's going through a mental health crisis, essentially. And this
would be like a call comes into 911.
Call comes into 911, and there's, someone, in a layman's terms, having a meltdown on the sidewalk in front of your house, or it could be a welfare check where, you might have an elderly neighbor that you haven't seen for a few days, so you call 911 and say, "Can you check on this person?" Those kinds of things. Nonviolent, at least at on the appearance, and of course, Knoxville has what they call a co-response model, where a police officer goes with a mental health professional to the scene. In case anything does happen, a police officer is there and can take care of anything that turns into a criminal matter. KPD's co-response teams, and now there are 4 of them now, and they're not all fully staffed. They will be soon, but their teams responded to, I think, 1,500 the first year calls. Fewer than 3% have wound up resulting in an arrest. The rest are, most of the rest were either they just kind of calmed everything down and got the whatever was going on, kind of resolved that issue. If it's a welfare check, they go in and see somebody's fine. They say, okay, well, great, see you later. A lot of them ended up with referrals or transfers to mental health services. But there is the other method of doing this, or another method of doing this, is called alternative response, and that is where instead of a police officer, a medic of some sort, a paramedic, EMT, whatever, goes with the mental health professional. Takes the police out of the equation. Advocates for it say that when the police are not involved, there's less of a chance of escalation. There are communities where this has been highly successful across the country. Eugene, Oregon, Denver, Colorado are always brought up as examples.
Well, and we have sort of worst case scenarios, including some in Knoxville over the years, of a call for response, often like from family members, about a family member in mental health crisis, and the police respond, and one thing happens or another thing happens, and the person ends up being shot. That does happen, and it has happened here. And I think that is very, it is partly to keep people out of the criminal justice system, but even beyond that, it's a concern that once you involve an armed officer, if something escalates, there's a possibility for somebody to literally get killed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, typically those are situations where an officer or officers respond and there are no mental health professionals there. That's kind of the whole point of the co-response thing, was to have a mental health professional who could help assess the situation, and if there's, and perhaps keep it from escalating. The folks who support alternative response say, well, why have them there at all? And so that's kind of those are the kind of the 2 approaches, and one's the city's already doing, The other, there is a group called Healing East Tennessee Alternative Response Team, HEART. They've been advocating for alternative response for about 3 years. They have a champion on city council, Councilwoman Amelia Parker. A month ago, she introduced a resolution calling for the establishment of a task force to come up with a pilot plan for an alternative response team. She postponed that for a month, and then it came back last week. In the meantime, Vice Mayor Andrew Roberto came up with and they had talked about this when Parker's resolution first came up. He came up with an alternative resolution to the alternative response task force resolution that said, that said this should be put in the context of mental health services in general, and the as they've talked about considerably, addressing mental health in general is something beyond the means of the city alone. So they wanted to bring, his resolution, called for bringing in the county, state, other partners to work together on something like this. Called for a joint work session with county commission, which they had a similar one a couple of years ago. So there's there's that that they wanted to do. Parker had a similar, yet another resolution, similar resolution to that, almost identical, and added a call for a public hearing where the public, generally on work sessions, it's the invited experts and commissioners and council members are the ones who speak. She wanted a public hearing where members of the public could speak and have their views aired. She ended up withdrawing the task force call. So you had two competing resolutions, virtually identical.
With the main difference that Parker's called for this.
That's the main. Yeah, that was the main.
And also that she didn't think it should hinge on the county and state being involved.
Right. I mean, basically, the difference, the approach is Roberto's would put it in the context of mental health services overall. Parker's was more narrow. This is this would be a program that that addresses a specific need that is in the city and not necessarily outside the city. So, so that was the main difference. There was some concern that from a couple of people, Councilwoman Singh, for example, who supports almost all the council members support alternative response in some shape, form, or fashion. But she wanted to make it clear that the city, if the county and the state didn't get involved, that the city wasn't would still move forward with it and that sort of thing. So there's a little tinkering done to Roberto's resolution. The thing is, they wound up approving both. So all the provisions of both apply. Now, of course, this is a resolution. This isn't an ordinance. It's a non-binding thing. Resolutions are, generally speaking, either expressions of opinion or intent. So, the city could decide not to do anything, and it's not right. It's
nobody's committed to anything.
Nobody's committed to anything,
except having, I guess, that the joint meeting with commission and also a public hearing.
Joint meeting won't happen unless they schedule it.
Right,
it still doesn't mean it's going to happen, although it is being scheduled. But there were a lot of there was a long discussion about this. There were some accusations from the folks at Heart that Roberto was trying to basically undermine what Parker had been doing. There's some political goings on. There are a lot of supporters in the crowd for Heart and the alternative response model. They got into a spat with Councilwoman Lauren Ryder. A lot of calling out from the audience, which has become more prevalent in recent years. eventually, when you take a kind of step back and take a look at it, there is kind of a consensus forming that yes, this is something we should explore. We will, our intent is to explore this with County Commission and perhaps the state of Tennessee, but this is definitely moving toward something, some sort of alternative response program, and how that will, that's, it's almost too early to even speculate on that, what that means. And there were some concerns. One is the McNabb Center provides the mental health professionals for the co-response team. They've said in the past that they prefer going out with police officers in case something happens.
Right, for the safety of their
employees,
yeah.
Who are going out. Councilwoman Janet Testerman talked about that. She also talked about the cost, because there would be some, especially startup costs associated with doing this program. Because right now, to the city, there's the cost of contracting with McNabb Center. Other than that, no real extra cost. Police officers are already on the payroll. Police vehicles are already in use. It's all, that part of it is, doesn't require any change. If they actually had a different standalone program, it would require more resources. So, she was really concerned about that, and and Charles Thomas was also concerned. He was concerned about the McNabb Center not being involved, because
in the conversation.
The McNabb Center is council members really respect and have a lot of put a lot of weight on what the McNabb Center does, because they are so they're the the largest provider of these types of services.
Both the city and the county contract with them extensively for a whole range of mental health programs.
Right, and the folks at Hart have said that they haven't met with McNabb Center folks. They say that they approached them a while back, and McNabb didn't want to meet with them, but we don't know. McNabb wasn't there at the meeting, but they said that they did have a meeting set up with them, or setting something up for next couple of weeks. But that was a big sticking point with Thomas, was that McNabb wasn't really involved in this, and couldn't understand why that the two organizations hadn't been able to sit down and talk about it. So when they both voted, Testerman and Thomas voted for Roberto's resolution, which passed unanimously, 9-0. They abstained on Parker's resolution, which means it passed 7-0, but they didn't vote on it. They abstained. And so what is happening now, Roberto said that he has talked to Commission Chair Courtney Durrett, and that they are scheduling a joint work session for August 3rd. So that will be the next step, and they're going to be looking at the mental health system, kind of the continuum here in Knox County, and where gaps may be, and how this would an alternative response program might fit into filling those gaps. And that's the next step. We'll see what comes out of it when they meet in August.
Well, and whether it's exactly what Amelia Parker has been pushing for, I do think you have to say that both she and Hart, even if they don't end up liking the final shape of whatever comes out, because we don't know what that's going to be, but they clearly have been successful in, as you say, over several years of advocating for this, in pushing this now to a point where, all of city council sees it as something they ought to at least talk about and look at. Absolutely.
And this has been one of the big focuses that Parker has had. She is kind of the loyal opposition. She also often is on the short end of 8-1 and 7-2 votes. This is I think you count it as a big win for her,
right,
to get this moving forward. And you're right. I mean, the end product will probably not look exactly like what she and Hart hope for, and what will end up happening, probably, which usually happens, is everybody gets together and starts talking about something, and things change over time. It might be, you might be thinking it's going to be one thing, it might end up being another. I know I spoke to one prominent supporter of the effort, and they said, well, the Eugene, Oregon programs run out of the health department there. Well, you got to get the county on board with that. If you want to do that here, it'd be a very different thing. It may not be the health department, doing it. It may be, the city could create a completely different office. It could be contracted out completely. So, how it's going to look and how they all work together. It's a real uneasy consensus.
Yeah.
And how they work together will determine how or what ends up coming out of it.
Right. All right. Well, more to come, as we often say. Couple of interesting things this week on some lawsuits challenging state restrictions on medical care for transgender people. We had a story that we ran that you can find on our website, an interview with Story Van Ness, who is a local, she's a transgender woman and advocate for, she works with Knox Pride, doing outreach, particularly to trans people in the community, providing support to trans people and their families and so forth. But she also herself was a Knox County school teacher for several years during the period when she came out as a transgender woman and began to transition. And what she found in doing that was that the employee health care plan that Knox County schools employees are under, which is actually the state employee health care plan that local school systems as divisions of the state essentially can opt into, and most do. So it's a state plan that the school system is part of, excludes gender affirming care from coverage. And maybe most people who are on the plan might not even know that, because unless it's a form of care that you are seeking, there's no reason you would. She said she was surprised to discover that. And so she went ahead and paid out of pocket for some initial care, but then there's a surgery, specifically in her case, facial reconstruction surgery, which is, when you hear about transgender surgeries, people most often think about, sort of breasts or genitals or whatever, but there are other forms too, and facial restructuring is one of them, and that is often to, make somebody's face look less masculine in this case. And she says that contributes to her gender dysphoria and sense of sort of not fully being the person who she is. And also she thinks subjects her to various kinds of risks, when she's out in public. People may look at her and think there's something weird about her and discriminate against her, or worse. And so she joined together with an employee at the University of Tennessee Chattanooga campus, who's an academic advisor down there, Gerda Zinner, also in the same situation, because they are also on the state plan. And they first filed a complaint last year with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is sort of a prerequisite. If you want to file a workplace sex discrimination suit, first you have to file a federal EEOC complaint. They did that, and then the EEOC basically studied it and gave them legal clearance, essentially, to go ahead and pursue this in federal court. So they've filed that lawsuit, and we had an interview with Story Van Ness and one of the attorneys. Now, one of the interesting things about this lawsuit is there's serious legal firepower behind it. The Transgender Legal Defense Fund. I think I'm missing a word from that name, but they're a national nonprofit organization that advocates for transgender civil rights, essentially, is on board, is kind of leading the suit. And then there's a very high-powered Washington, D.C. law firm that's also working on it on a pro bono basis. So lots of, this is a serious case, basically. And so we had an interview with Story Van Ness and Ezra Cooker, who's one of the attorneys working on it. And their basic case is that, look, this is just straight up sex discrimination. You are singling out one particular group of people and saying that other people might be, like, for example, a woman who's covered by this plan who wants to get breast reduction surgery and has that prescribed, indicated by a doctor, could get it covered. But if you are getting breast reduction surgery as part of a gender transition, it wouldn't be covered, and that's discrimination, basically. And several other courts that have considered these kinds of suits have actually found that it is probably discriminatory. So that's what we talk. Suddenly, sort of transgender and gender issues are very prominent right now in our cultural and legal discussion for lots of different reasons, in all sorts of different ways. You sort of, on the one hand, it's the long-range culmination, not necessarily the only culmination, but a result of 50 plus years of organized efforts on behalf of LGBTQ people, and so that basically people saying this is who we are, and we ought to be able to be who we are and have access to all of the same rights and privileges that other people do, including health coverage. And on the other hand, of course, there's been a big pushback and backlash, culturally conservative, a lot of religious conservative pushback, lots of assertions that, there are only two genders, that there's no such thing as transgender people, or that if you are a transgender person, nobody else should have to recognize that or support it or provide health care coverage for it. And that case is in federal court right now. The Knox County School Board, University of Tennessee, and the state are all named defendants in it. And as of as of last week, none of them had even filed a response yet to the lawsuit. So probably it has some ways to go before we see what happens there. But interestingly, sort of like the day after we wrote about that suit, a federal judge in Middle Tennessee came out and basically slapped an injunction on the state about another restriction on gender care, which is the law that we've talked about here a bunch, basically prohibiting gender-affirming care for transgender minors. And a judge in Nashville in the U.S. District Court basically said that too was discriminatory, and that again, he kind of used a somewhat similar example, saying that some of the kinds of care that are being talked about here, for example, hormone therapy, well, that's something that can be given to people, including minors, for any number of reasons and conditions, and that this law was basically singling out one group of people and saying that even if a doctor prescribes it, you can't get it if it's for this reason. We're going to leave these other reasons. And the judge basically said that even though the law doesn't explicitly say the word transgender anywhere, it's totally clear that what they're doing is saying we don't want transgender people to have access to this.
Well, that's one of the things that has struck me about these laws is that it doesn't really talk about the procedure. It talks about the motivation behind the procedure. And there is a lot of, I think it's pretty obvious, if you talk about breast augmentation, for example, that someone who's transitioning to becoming a female would likely undergo. There are a lot more people get breast augmentation who are women who just want larger breasts, right? Than there are people who are transitioning. and these are all those are elective. I mean, that's an elective surgery. That's not something, a lot of, breast removal a lot of times is related to breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
But the, breast augmentation is generally speaking a voluntary, elective procedure. And these laws basically say, well, that's okay in one, if this is your motivation, but if that's your motivation, it's not. And I think that's one of the don't know what will ultimately prevail, obviously, but I think that's one of the more compelling arguments that that Van Ness and others can make, is that, hey, it's this is just surgery. It's not
right, and you're pretty clearly singling out one group of people.
Yeah,
and and so in the case with the injunction, I mean, basically that. The injunction doesn't even apply to the whole law. This is the one about procedures for minors, because the plaintiffs who brought the case were only seeking to continue non-surgical therapies, hormone therapy, and that kind of thing, and so they didn't have standing to challenge the surgical part of the law. So that is still in place unless or until there's another lawsuit challenging that from somebody. But for now, that prohibition on providing non-surgical medical therapies has been enjoined. And so people who have been receiving those, that was going to take effect today, the day we're taping this, July 1st. And so that part of it has been blocked. Those people who have been receiving those can continue to, while the case still has to work its way through trial. But before we even get to the case going to trial, the state has already appealed the injunction. So that's going to go to the Sixth Circuit, and we'll see what comes out of there. Although, again, the judge in this case noted that every other court that has heard a case like this having to do with gender-affirming care for minors has also found it unconstitutional, and that's courts in Arkansas, Alabama, Florida. And another interesting thing to mention about this is that this judge, like the judge who also found the state's restrictions on drag performances, enjoined the state's restriction on drag performances in West Tennessee a month ago or so. Both of those judges were appointed to the federal bench by former President Donald Trump. So we are not, a lot of times when you see these kind of decisions come down, people will go online and be like, well, here go these radical leftist judges. Well, I don't know much about these judges, but I'm guessing they're not radical leftists.
Yeah, I don't think so. That's not. I don't think President Trump appointed very many radical leftist judges to the bench. So
again, all these are still in process. A long way to go. Some of these cases could end up at the Supreme Court. I mean, there is, again, a lot of just kind of political and cultural ferment around all of these issues of gender. I think we can anticipate continuing to hear a lot about them as we head into next year's election cycle. And some of these cases are playing out right here at home. Okay, let's look at, speaking of federal courts, on Thursday, the U.S. Supreme Court was very busy this past week, of course, because it was the last week of the session. It's when they often issue a lot of their big decisions, and they did, and we're not going to talk about all of them, but one that they issued on Thursday was essentially finding affirmative action efforts to increase student diversity at the University of North Carolina and Harvard University unconstitutional. They said you cannot consider race as a factor. Interestingly, Scott, that decision came down the same day the UT, University of Tennessee Board of Trustees was meeting, and they also were talking about efforts to diversify their student population. So what did you learn?
Yeah, that was the timing was extraordinary. Right after the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court decision basically ends affirmative action in college admissions all across the country. One of the things that happened later that day was the Board of Trustees Education, Research and Service Committee met. They talked about there was a presentation about how the UT system, campus by campus, each campus on the in the UT system, compared with their peer institutions on a variety of factors, one of which, and one that was singled out for a lot of discussion, was race and the racial composition of their student bodies. And it was one of the most striking findings is that UT, first of all, has barely improved as far as the percentage of students who, minority students who make up the student body. And by minority, we're talking about racial and ethnic minorities. So you're talking about African Americans, you're talking about Hispanic students, that kind of thing. So the UT Knoxville, and I'll focus on UT Knoxville. They did this for every campus. UT Knoxville in 2017 had 18% minority students enrolled. In 2021, it was 19%. So there really wasn't much improvement. And what was even more striking is UT trails its peers in some insignificant ways. First of all, they've got two kinds of peers. One group called comparable peers. They're ones that UT considers themselves currently in the same general class as. At the time of the study, these lists have changed a little bit since outside the study period, just last year. But during this time, some of the comps were Auburn, Clemson, University of Alabama, Iowa State, North Carolina State, those kinds of schools. They also have a group called aspirational peers, and those are schools that UT wants to be like. They want to be like Michigan State and Purdue and Florida, and at the time Florida's off the list now. A lot of people are probably glad, but Georgia, Wisconsin, those are schools that made up the aspirational list. And then there's also the Southeastern Conference schools, and kind of how they always measure themselves against SEC schools, even though SEC. Anyway, it's not a sports thing. It's just but UT trails all of them, and some by significant ways. I mean, like I said, UT Knoxville has 19% minority student body, at least in 2021. Then its comparable institutions, 23%. Well, they're a little behind the Auburns and Alabamas and North Carolina states of the world. But SEC schools, it's 28%. They're comparable. They're the aspirational peers. This is what they want to be like. 29% minority student enrollment. So they're way below them. That sparked quite a bit of discussion. And of course, given the Supreme Court decision, it's kind of like, okay, well, what, none of these, no school that already looks at increasing minority enrollment is going to change that as a goal. It's going to be how do you get there? And one of the so you can't take race into consideration. Well, one of the things about the Harvard and North Carolina cases is that both schools, race was a factor, and really you can only make it a factor. It can't be the factor
because there was already a Supreme Court precedent that said it couldn't be the only reason.
Yeah, that's the famous Bakke decision in 1978. So both of those schools they had everything else was factored in, and then race was considered part of it. UT, I reached out to the UT Knoxville campus. They said that they don't consider race. Now, I mean, they had not been considering race as a factor to begin with, which those who support affirmative action would say, well, yeah, that's why affirmative action is needed. You haven't improved any, and the reason you haven't improved was because you haven't been considering race. But but they hadn't been. So and President Boyd, of course, speaking, addressing this as a system-wide perspective, because all every campus in the UT system was behind its peers in minority admissions, period, across the board. And Chattanooga, Martin, Southern, the Health Science Center, all of them. And Boyd said, we'll be reviewing our policies based on the Supreme Court decision, making any changes that have to be made, that sort of thing. but apparently they won't have to be made at UT Knoxville. And so we know one of the things that people who look at education nationwide are saying is that this will cause a drop in minority attendance at colleges and universities across the country, and of course, this will primarily affect the more competitive schools, because they're the ones who are really who really could make a difference in this. Kind of an example of that, UT's not really that competitive a school. Nearly 7 out of 10 people who apply to UT get admitted to UT. Now, obviously not all go, not all enroll, but only about a quarter of them, the ones who are admitted, enroll. But University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which was the school involved in this, was about 20% get admitted. Harvard, of course, 4%. So those schools, are really really the ones that will be most affected. But everybody's affected. There are states, Florida, California, Michigan. These states have laws that prevent their state universities from admitting or from using race as a factor, and all of them, state universities, are struggling to increase minority enrollment. Mm-hmm. So the strategies that are available to increase minority enrollment are limited. One of the schools like Harvard can say, okay, don't say, I'm not saying they would. They can say, okay, well, we're no longer going to accept legacies here, which are people who are descendants of others who had gone to Harvard. The Harvard men, just because daddy went to Harvard doesn't mean you can get in now, or if they change. But there's no such thing at the University of Tennessee or the University of North Carolina, these other schools. So really, there may be a bigger emphasis on socioeconomic factors and things like that. But there's it really does limit what universities and colleges can do to attract more African American and Hispanic students.
Yeah, and I think just for some context, because these percentages in and of themselves, it's hard to know, like, what percentage sort of should it be, and of course they can't have racial quotas. Like that's
right.
It was already not legal to have racial.
That
quotas.
Was the whole Bakke thing in '78.
Especially not legal now to have racial quotas. But what would be a reasonable percentage? And I think one thing that's interesting is there was a state comptroller's report in 2020 that looked at Tennessee's pre-K through 12 student population. So it kind of tells you, who is the pool of potential college students in Tennessee. And I thought it was interesting that showed that only 61% of Tennessee K-12 students are white, and I think it was 24% are black, and then another 12% were Latino. So if you're looking at a state university system that is run by the state to serve, UT always talks about their mission is to serve all the people of Tennessee from all backgrounds. And if they are, if 39% of students in K-12 are non-white and only 19% of UT Knoxville students are, well, that's a pretty sizable gap, basically.
Yeah, and one thing that this wasn't brought out in the report, and they didn't talk about it. I don't have the exact numbers on it, but one thing that has been going on at UT Knoxville is a marked increase in out-of-state students who they made that a big point of emphasis to bring in. At least they've been talking about, we're getting more and more out-of-state students coming in. That does a couple of things. First of all, it might skew those statistics a little bit depending on how big this is. And also, but one of the things that they really like about out-of-state students is their expenses will stay the same, essentially, but the tuition income is
Right.
much greater.
They pay that out-of-state tuition, right?
Yeah, they really like that out-of-state tuition. So I don't, and who knows how that's going to affect it. That they may say, well, we're going to increase our recruiting efforts in other states to bring in, hopefully pull in more minority students from other states to come in. They may redouble their efforts in Tennessee they can still recruit more heavily in areas with a higher African American population, but they just can't make race the reason to admit them.
Right.
And now one of the other things that I'll be that they talked about besides race in this, because UT usually gives that pretty rosy takes on their things, and there's one rosy bit of data that they talked about was increase in enrollment. They have increased enrollment faster than just about every school in all of its peer categories. Great for you. Now, four-year graduation rates, while they're going up tremendously, still lag all the other peers. Their 6-year graduation rate, which has remained relatively unchanged, and it lags behind all of the other peers. What all that tells you is that there are a lot of students, instead of taking 6 years, they're taking 4 years. So the 6-year graduation rate is much more indicative of how likely it is for you to graduate from a university. The 1-year retention rate, which you're bringing in all these new students after the first year. How many do you keep who can go on to get those degrees in 4 years or 6 years? At retention rate, they're also way behind the other. Not way behind, but they're behind their peers in that. So this report was not kind of a real rosy picture of how
it wasn't a pat on the back report.
No, it wasn't. And the trustees acknowledged that. One of the things that was interesting is none of the members of this committee talked about the Supreme Court decision. They didn't bring it up.
Mm-hmm.
It had been out for several hours. They didn't even say, well, we'll have to wait and see how this affects us. They didn't even talk about it. They didn't bring it up. But they did bring up concerns about this, that especially on the minority enrollment figures, that was something that they really wanted to understand why, and those figures have not improved and what they can do to improve them.
Right. And so, like you say, it remains a priority for the university regardless of the Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court decision does not say that universities can't pay attention to this and can't think about how can we diversify our student body. It just says you can't do it this way. Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the goal. The goal, you can set whatever goals you want to set, but you can't consider race in order to reach that goal.
Right. Another quick thing to mention related to UT and the city of Knoxville both was they found out this week, we've talked about this proposed pedestrian bridge to connect the UT campus to the south bank of the Tennessee River, and they had applied for a $25 million federal grant, which would go toward whatever the ultimate cost of this thing would be, and they didn't get it.
They did not get it. It came out Thursday night, the 28th. Wednesday night. It came out Wednesday. Actually, they posted it on their website a little bit earlier than that, and I looked at that right before I went to bed and went, "Oh, I'm going to have to do this tomorrow." But it's a federal transportation grant. Their $25 million grants went to infrastructure projects all across the country. Highly competitive. These projects are designed to help lower income communities. And the South Knox waterfront at this area is considered just that, a kind of an economically challenged community. And they weren't, the state of Tennessee or the city of Knoxville and wasn't on the list, so they didn't get it. Only 2 projects were accepted in the state of Tennessee, both of them in Memphis. There were a handful of pedestrian bridges that were approved across the country. I believe it was 7, and because there were well over 100 of these grants that went out, so it was a lot of cities got them, but they're spread all over the country. But and none of the pedestrian bridges that were approved were as big as Knoxville's. Most of them went over highways or went over railroad yards or things like that. So. Anyway, so that was a big blow. City was very disappointed that they didn't get it. I talked to R.J. Justice, who is the Deputy Economic Development Officer for the city, and she was saying, we're disappointed, but they're still going to move forward with the project. They think they are going to have to look for other funding partners. Now, the state of Tennessee's provided $20 million. To go toward this, and the estimated cost right now is about $70 million. So there's still a lot of money left. This would have been $25 million. That would have given them $45 million. Now they still just have $20 million. They are going to look for other partners. They are going to look for other sources of revenue, other grants, that sort of thing. So it doesn't mean the project is dead, but it certainly isn't. The patient's not healthy.
Yeah.
So
well, and it's worth noting this is the second time the city has applied for a federal grant for this bridge. They did it 10 years ago for a different federal grant program and didn't get it then either. So this is twice under 2 different administrations have turned this idea down for federal funding.
Yeah. Well, there were 2 different grant programs, but the result was the same. And one thing that Justice told me was that the city's going to be talking with the U.S. Department of Transportation, or probably more their contractor would be talking with them to try to find out why. What was the reason? Where did we fall short? Or was it just a numbers thing? And it could be, or is there a combination? And so they're looking at that, but that's just kind of a look back and see what you did wrong, which is important, but they're also planning to look forward and seeing what other money might be out there, because I don't think that anyone in the city has the idea that they've got $20 million in state funding and they're spending $50 million in city money. That just it's not on the horizon.
Yeah.
So
seems like it would be, given all of the city's other obvious needs. Part of the discussion here is that UT has also purchased property on the south side of the river there, which people anticipate they'll probably look to build housing of some kind as part of their ongoing effort to meet their housing demand, and that the pedestrian bridge would provide obviously easy access there.
Yeah, in fact, that was going to be the landing site.
Right,
exactly. The South Knoxville landing side of the bridge was going to be on this UT property.
Well, I want to suggest a maybe cheaper alternative here, going back into Knoxville's own history. What about a ferry? We used to have ferries all through Knox County, and there's still places with there's Brown's Ferry and Wright's Ferry and so forth. Why not just run a ferry back and forth across the river?
Well, Jesse, I've not heard that proposal, but I'm intrigued. It could be. I remember where I grew up in Roane County, we had a ferry that went from Kingston to kind of the north end of the county, going toward Oliver Springs, way far from Oliver Springs, a place called Sugar Grove Valley. Beautiful little name for it. A beautiful little valley. But had a ferry that went there, that operated there. And I confess that there were times where when I was just out driving around, as teenagers are wont to do, I would go ride the ferry just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
I didn't even need there wasn't even a destination on the other side. There was a farmland on the other side. So, but here you would have a destination there. The ferry might be a good alternative. There are there are, lots of boats in East Tennessee, and kind of a Vol Navy thing.
I was going to say, make it part of the Vol Navy.
Yeah, good. I think that
there's my free idea for the UT Board of Trustees.
There you go, and the city of Knoxville. I'll ask city officials about the ferry in the coming weeks. So.
All right, and the other thing we had to talk about today. This was news that just broke on Friday. I guess technically, did they release it in the morning? I'm trying to decide if we can call it a Friday news dump. I think of any
yes.
big bad news that comes out after noon on a Friday is definitely a Friday news dump. I think this came out maybe noon-ish.
It was noonish. I don't remember the exact time.
But basically, this was Brooklyn Belk, recently hired deputy chief in a new position, the Knoxville Police Department. Who they made a big hoopla about hiring just 4 months ago. She has left. So what happened?
Yeah, what KP did was they created a new department, an office of professional responsibility, essentially, and it was designed to come up to review and revise policies and procedures and be kind of the umbrella under which the Internal Affairs Unit, what used to be known as the Internal Affairs Unit, operates. And they hired Brooklyn Belk to do this. Belk is a former prosecutor. She is an adjunct faculty member at the University of Tennessee School of Law. She's worked in the private sector. She's got a lot of experience, and she's also done training on issues with police departments, including the Knoxville Police Department in the past. So they hired her to much fanfare in February. One is she is a civilian. She's not. She's the highest ranking civilian in the force, the only deputy chief who is not a sworn police officer, and that's what I mean by civilian. I usually don't like to use the term civilian in opposition to police officers because that's more of a military thing, and police officers are not supposed to be military anyway. But she's the only deputy chief who is not a sworn officer. She came into the job. A lot of people talked about her qualifications and all, but then she all of a sudden resigns after 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of an interesting press release that KPD sent out. They didn't say why she resigned. I was able to obtain her resignation letter, and it was basically said much of the same stuff that was in the press release, but didn't say that she was leaving to take another job, but obviously she will probably be looking for another job if she doesn't already have one.
Right, but it's not like she was hired away by somebody, and I believe Chief Paul Noel's statement was something to the effect of, well, we always knew we wouldn't have her for long. Which I just have to say, I didn't find super credible. I mean, if she left after 2 years, and you could say she did all this work, and we knew she was going to go on to great things, but like 4 months, like it didn't sound very plausible.
Yeah. I was about to get to that. That's one of the big things is they said basically this was always considered a temporary thing. Well, they didn't say that when they hired her. They didn't say, oh, this is temporary until we can, until she, obviously any job, you're going to hire somebody until they take another job or retire. I mean, that's the whole point. But they did not say that it was going to be a short-term thing. They did, and they were very insistent on that, because I did, reach out to KPD, try to find out, okay, well, what's the real reason, what's going on here. And there are a lot of rumors running around, a lot of information. I'll tell you one thing, probably the one city agency city department where rumors and whether they're true or not are rampant, but they are almost always contradictory. That's KPD.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of when I talk to people, and of course I'm not reporting any of it unless I verify any of it. I don't want to talk about any of it here.
We cannot repeat the rumors that are circulating because we don't know which, if any, of them are true.
But KPD officials are only saying basically what's in the press release. So,
well, and of course, when it comes to these kinds of personnel issues where somebody is leaving under who knows what circumstances, there's lots of reasons for the city and for KPD to be very cagey about it because, you can run into, they could always be sued by somebody.
Right.
If, they described it in a way that person found, demeaning or something. Who knows? But it clearly raises a lot of questions, and it I think is a little bit of a setback for Chief Noel in his efforts because she was kind of a centerpiece of his effort, as he put it, to make KPD more responsive, more transparent, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons he was hired was to change the culture of KPD. And a big part of that is establishing policies and procedures. A big part of that is internal policing, whether it's through the Internal Affairs Unit or their active bystander training that they've just started in recent months, where trying to nip problems in the bud before something happens that would go through internal affairs and that sort of thing. So there's been a lot of upheaval in internal affairs. There's been, it's no longer called internal affairs, but the unit has almost completely turned over. We've talked about this. There's only one investigator who was there when Noel was hired in the internal affairs unit. So there's a lot going on in that space, and one of the things you run into is of course there's a lot of change. There's a lot of resistance to change. Mm-hmm. This kind of hints that a lot of these things are going on, but nothing. There's nothing explicit yet about exactly what was going on there. But it does, her departure after 4 months. Even if they had said it was going to be temporary, if they didn't say it was going to be 4 months, then it'd still raise questions because very few people just take a job on a 4-month assignment. So it does kind of raise questions about what's going on there. And you say, right, it is a setback. One of the things that did, they've said there wasn't a motivating factor, but the Belk is African American. She is the department has had an awful hard time recruiting African American officers.
Right. Speaking of diversity efforts,
speaking of diversity efforts, they've had very few African American officers. They have none above the rank of lieutenant. So she was the highest rank, even though she's not a sworn officer. She was the highest ranking African American in the department. She is leaving. We don't know, obviously, who they're going to find as a replacement. They said they're going to do a nationwide search, so it'll be another outsider, probably, although it could be somebody from within the ranks. You can imagine, but they explicitly said it's going to be a nationwide search, which like Belk, there'd be somebody who would be coming in, and Noel himself, someone who would come into the department from outside. Which KPD's culture has always been a promote from within kind of operation. So that how that is accepted by the rank and file officers is will be another thing to watch.
And you are pursuing this. You are out there asking questions, as are some of our other colleagues in the local media. And so I guess stay tuned. Maybe some more clarity could yet. We're going to keep asking about these things. We can't force people to tell us what they're not willing to tell us. If anybody knows anything, feel free to call Scott. Seth, why don't we go ahead and take a quick break here? We'll come back and do our Q&A. Okay, so we are to the Q&A part of our podcast. Every week we go onto our Facebook-only subscribers group, the Compass Colloquy, which you can join if you are a Compass subscriber, which you can do by going to CompassKnox.com. And we ask the folks on there if there's anything they would like to hear us talk about on the podcast. One of the things that got raised this week was something that the Knox County School Board had a first vote on this past month, and will be having the second and final vote on at its meeting coming up in July. And this has to do with basically awarding school credit to kids who leave school during the school day to go to an approved release time program. And to give a little bit of background to this, release time programs, also sometimes called Bible release time, because although they can take sort of any, it could theoretically be any religion. You could have satanic release time. But in practice, what almost all of these are is they're programs that are run by churches, and students voluntarily can choose during the school day to be excused from school for like one class period, basically, go to a local church or someplace that the church has secured, and get religious instruction, essentially. And then they go back to school for the rest of the school day. So this is something that has been legal. There's a Supreme Court case going back to the 1950s having to do with this, and the Supreme Court basically said that, yes, this is something that school systems can legally choose to do. And in Tennessee, that was the status of the law for a long time, that school systems could choose to allow this if they wanted to. Knox County most recently had a proposal for it 3 or 4 years ago, and had created a pilot program for it, and basically decided not to expand that program at that time. It was a divisive issue. I think that was a 5-4 vote. But then a year or two after that, the state legislature stepped in, as they are wont to do, and they just put it down by fiat, basically, that it didn't need school system approval anymore, that you can do this anywhere in the state, and school systems have to allow it. So that is now the law. Also, they added to that, not only do you have to allow people to do it, but school systems can't, this is the part they left optional, school systems can choose to actually give academic credit for this. Mm-hmm. In the past, what it said, oh, who's calling us? Is a hot tip about Brooklyn Belk? So what they did, we're having technical difficulties, folks.
Sorry about that. That was my phone, and I apologize.
It's okay. It might have been very important. We don't know. No comment from Scott. So anyway, the state said that you can let kids who choose to do this also earn academic credit. That wasn't the case before. And so the school system is changing. There's a proposed policy change that would allow students to earn essentially 1 credit a year if you're going out and doing this. A little unclear to me exactly how many hours. The law allows it to be, I think, up to 1 hour a day, but some of them are set up to be an hour a week or an hour a month. So I don't know exactly how many hours you would need to qualify for this credit. But that's what this is. There was a question basically like, what is this Bible release time credit that students are going to be able to earn? And that's what they're talking about. But the bigger picture to it is school board member Susan Horn, who's been a big supporter of this, has cited a Christian Learning Center in Campbell County as a model for something that could come to Knox County. And so in Campbell County, they have a setup to do this release time, and they've actually created what they call a Christian Learning Center. Conveniently, in Campbell County, it's real close to one of their schools, and so the students can just literally walk out of the school, we're getting many phone calls here. We're very popular. Maybe we should do a fund drive. Call now. But basically, the goal appears to be, and I think there's an organization interested in doing this, and we'll be writing more about this in the future. But the goal is to actually create something like that here and have some kind of Christian learning center. It seems like it would be a little trickier in Knox County because Campbell County has many fewer schools than Knox County does, and so it would be easier to maybe locate something centrally in a way that students could easily get to it. If you create something in Knox County, don't know exactly where it would be, how students would get there during the school day, because the school system does not provide transportation for this. So churches that are doing it have to kind of do that themselves, and they're only allowed to be gone for like the space of one class period. And so if you had a Christian learning center in Farragut and you had students in Gibbs, for example, I don't know how that would work. The logistics seem kind of complicated. So we need to learn more about exactly what is conceived here. But all the school board is approving is the policy change that will allow a credit to be awarded for that. But it sounds like there are also plans for something sort of bigger and more organized. One part of the policy says that in order to earn that credit, the instruction has to be provided by somebody who is actually a licensed Tennessee teacher. It can't just be a pastor in the church or something. Of course, I mean, it could be a pastor who's also a licensed teacher,
right?
But it does have to be somebody with actual teaching license. Now, the content of the course, the school system is allowed to review the curriculum, but they are not allowed to object to it on religious grounds. So if there's something about the curriculum that they think is problematic or something that doesn't have to do with the fact that it's essentially religious instruction, like that, the whole point of this is to allow religious instruction. So the school board can't say, we don't like your curriculum because it promotes religious instruction. Like that's right. Actually what the law allows. But they can review the curriculum under a sort of set of criteria to make sure that they think students are being taught something suitable or appropriate, I guess.
Yeah, and of course, really don't have a lot to add to that because that's you covered it really well. One of the things that strikes me about this has really nothing to do with its religious nature versus the secular mission and all that. It's the name, calling it release time, that reinforces the idea to these kids that school's jail.
Yeah,
like, well, yeah, it's
kind of like being out on a work release.
Yeah, it's like a work release, Bible release, whatever. It's like, oh, that's but
which is how a lot of kids think of school. I think
I did. Yeah. I think everybody did. When I was growing up. So
the other thing I'll mention is that one of the concerns about these kinds of programs from people who are strong believers in the separation of church and state is that, this is all kind of pushing us toward allowing explicit religious instruction / indoctrination, or whatever you want to call it, evangelizing during the course of the school day, and then in this case actually awarding public school credit for that. And that is true. I mean, that's kind of what it's doing. But it may turn out to be a sort of minor step compared to some of the other things that are already in the works elsewhere in the country. The state of Oklahoma has just awarded a first ever public school charter to an explicitly religious school, which is not something that has happened before. Proponents and advocates of charter schools have always insisted that charter schools are public schools. They should be treated like other public schools. They are not religious schools. But Oklahoma has basically passed a law saying, no, we're going to go ahead and say that charter schools can also be religious schools, that it can be an explicitly religious course taught, according to the dictates of one particular faith. And that is going to have to be tested in the courts, probably. It'll be some time before we see what happens with that. But if, say, a program like that were allowed some court, maybe the Supreme Court eventually says that, yes, you can have publicly funded charter schools that are actually, like a Baptist school or something, then things like this, allowing 1 credit for Bible release time, are going to look like pretty small potatoes when it comes to separation of church and state. We're going to have something much more explicit and comprehensive than what we're looking at here. So anyway, it's an interesting issue.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, looking ahead to next week, we don't have a lot to look ahead to next week. It is the 4th of July, which is on a Tuesday this year. And I feel like when the 4th of July is on any of those sort of, if it's on a Monday or Friday, it just gives you sort of like a long weekend. If it's on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, it sort of becomes a whole week in a way. Nobody really plans or schedules anything for this week.
Yeah, it's an invitation to vacation.
Exactly.
Is what that is. And like you said, instead of a 3-day weekend, it's a week-long vacation.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like to take that. They already get, they save a vacation day by doing that. So yeah, it's going to be a slow week on the civics front.
Except for the festival on the 4th, which will be at World's Fair Park, as always. Fireworks and Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, all that.
And one thing that might want to mention, it's kind of funny that on holidays like Labor Day, which used to be Boomsday here, had the Boomsday celebration, and New Year's, 4th of July, when people like to go out and set off fireworks in their own yards or in their own neighborhoods and have their own fireworks thing. Mayor India Kincannon at the last city council meeting made sure that she asked Chief Sharp, the fire chief, if setting off fireworks in the city is legal or illegal, and he responded that it is illegal. So
yes,
you kids, watch out there. This could go on your permanent record.
And not widely enforced,
at
least judging from the experience of my neighborhood.
I will say this: if that is the case, then North Knoxville would be a crime-ridden area on Tuesday when the 4th comes around.
Although, as far as crime in North Knoxville goes, I have to say I'll take fireworks over most of the rest of the kinds of crime that we get.
Absolutely. So,
but I don't want to. A lot of people don't like fireworks. Pets don't like fireworks. People with PTSD a lot of times don't like fireworks. I understand it is, it can be an issue beyond just being a nuisance for some people, and I certainly have sympathy for that.
Killed my great-grandfather.
Killed your great-grandfather?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Of course, this was around the turn of the last century. He was out with some his business folk. He ran a general store in Benton, Tennessee. Threw a firecracker, which is probably stronger than the firecrackers we have nowadays. Didn't go off. He went and picked it up, blew up in his hand. He got blood poisoning, then lockjaw, and died.
Oh,
and so terrible. It was a pretty traumatic experience for our family. If that had not happened, that's what sent that part of my family out of that county and into the wider world of the rest of Tennessee and all that good stuff. So it was it was the reason that when I was a child, I was not allowed to play with fireworks.
Yeah. Well,
so we do understand. We are sensitive
careful
to,
out there, folks.
We are sensitive to reasons that people do not like fireworks, and and as Chief Sharp said, it is illegal, but we also understand that it often does not get enforced.
Well, happy 4th of July to everybody.
Absolutely.
And we will be back next week to talk about, it might be a short episode next week, because unlike this past week, we don't anticipate a whole lot of news, but the thing about news is it's hard to anticipate.
That's right. That's why it's news.
Talk to you later. Oh, before we go, thanks to Lord Seth Barber for production here at Barbarian Studios, and our theme music is by Will Wright.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.